Hello. Some of the comments to my last brief talk on Nick Fuentes set me thinking, and I thought it would be good to reply to them with another talk rather than put a long reply in the comments. There were two comments in particular, one about Catholic and Protestant relations, and one stating Nick Fuentes is the future, boomers are on the way out. I will read the first comment verbatim and deal with this first. This was quite a long comment, and it went, "Sir, you do not know what you are talking about concerning relations between Catholics and conservative Protestants of the non-Zionist type in the present-day US. The type of large-scale, widespread Catholic oppression mentioned was long gone and had to be by the time JFK was elected. Yes, there is anti-Catholic sentiment among some of the really hardcore Southern evangelicals, but it's much diminished from the levels of many decades ago that you're talking about. Ben Shapiro is engaged in some deep wishful thinking on this one, and I suspect that you are too. Truly, you should consider what it means that all 6 conservative US Supreme Court justices who enjoy widespread conservative Christian backing are Catholics. I mean, really, the Catholic-Protestant tensions in America never reached the fevered levels and mass slaughter of Britain's past. Might I suggest you retreat back to your academic ivory tower for more study and contemplation, or ask your intel agency handlers for better talking points, which applies to your situation. God bless and thanks for reading." So, firstly, I am well aware of Catholics in public life in the US, and that the days of Catholic persecution are long gone. This was, in fact, part of my point, and part of the reason for my talk in the first place. But I'm glad that the comment was made, because it means I will have to explain my position further, which I hope will be interesting. I will start by relating a conversation I had a few days ago with a close friend who runs a well-known Catholic traditionalist blog. And by the way, he is a young chap and not a decrepit boomer, and the blog in question is of a very high academic caliber. I said to him, "The splitting of the right in the USA and elsewhere at the moment is ostensibly about Israel and Zionists, but I think it is actually a sideshow. The divide is in fact between old-fashioned Burkean conservatism versus hardline absolutism, e.g. pre-Vatican II Catholicism. Those are the absolute black and white baselines, but of course the divide usually manifests itself on a scale of grey. But I am interested how the Catholic Church ever managed to permeate the secular structures of these post-Westphalian pluralist democracies. Surely there had to be a compromise somewhere." And my friend replied, "Yes, this is related in Elizabeth Fenton's Religious Liberties, Anti-Catholicism and Liberal Democracy in 19th Century US Literature and Culture." And I replied, "But what do you think? Do you think people should be allowed to practice their religions apart from Catholicism?" My friend replied, "They should be tolerated when it is necessary for the sake of peace only in a state. But ideally the Catholic religion should be established by law, and this is the key thing," he continues. "No one has a right to practice a false religion." I replied, "If this is really what you are saying, it flies completely in the teeth of the American Constitution, and it's no wonder that Catholics were suspect for a long time in the USA. I suppose what I'm interested in is how aligned your belief is to the pre-modern world or not. Personally, I think that everyone in the West has been affected by modernity. I mean conservatives as well as progressives, to one degree or another. Although I think that some parts of the Islamic world are still pre-modern, e.g. Saudi Arabia is a state where error has no rights. And this was my key question. Don't you think that Catholic doctrine is fundamentally at odds with the American founding fathers?" And my friend replied, "Yes, I do. That Fenton book's great for that. Her conclusion is that Catholics were only accepted in the US when they rejected Catholicism, basically. The Catholic Church teaches that error has no rights. The author of that book is a modernist and thinks the recent change is a good thing, but it's still a very good book. So that was the end of that conversation. And here I would like to quote two excerpts from some key documents. Here are two errors condemned by the Catholic Church in the 19th century in Pius IX's famous syllabus of errors. Error 15 was, and I quote, "Every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true." Error 77. In our age, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. And I would oppose this with quoting now from the American Constitution, which states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Now, the doctrine of the Catholic Church up until Vatican II, and I will come to that in a minute, was that the Catholic Church was the single repository of the truth, and one had to, in fact, be subject to the Roman Pontiff in order to be saved. The famous bull Unum Sanctum states, and I quote, "Furthermore, we declare and we proclaim and we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff." And later, "It is necessary that the temporal authority be subject to the spiritual power." Now, this doctrine, of course, put Catholics in a very awkward position in the post-Westphalian, increasingly secularised modern world, especially in the United Kingdom and the United States. After Vatican I, Gladstone famously declared that Catholics could no longer be trusted as loyal subjects, and Newman made his famous remarks about toasting to conscience and the Pope. It is a huge subject, explored in books such as the one mentioned by Elizabeth Fenton previously. Now, all of this changed with Vatican II and its document Dignitatis Humanae, which stated point blank that, and I quote, "the human person has a right to religious freedom," thus performing a 180-degree turn on centuries of Catholic dogma. It was one of the most controversial documents of the Council and was hotly debated at the time and still is today. A good example of the new Catholic ethos is in fact the one given by the commentator about the Supreme Court. It is true that the Catholic judges, thanks to God, overturned Roe versus Wade. But this was done on a completely secularist and originalist argumentation, rather than Catholic moral teaching on the evil of abortion. In effect, the New Catholics, as other denominations, made a concordat with modernity. They were no longer crying Deus Vult and proclaiming the kinship of Christ and Catholic absolutism. They were no longer rejecting democracy and elevating sacral monarchy, but incorporating themselves into post-Enlightenment pluralist America. In fact, these compromises were made not only in America, but the world over, so powerful have been the forces of modernity. Even in late Tsarist Russia, the last true absolute Christian monarchy left in Europe, the Tsar approved the construction of the largest mosque in Europe in St. Petersburg and attended at its inauguration. This would never have happened in pre-modern, pre-Enlightenment Europe. The overarching point I'm trying to make here, and perhaps it is a subtle one, is that the rhetoric of the new hard right, identitarian right, or whatever you want to call it, is just that. With its Templar flags and cries of Deus Vult, it pretends to the pre-modern, but is in fact tainted by modernity, as everything is. I am interested in the rhetoric of what people say they believe and the reality of how they behave. So here are some quotes from Nick Fuentes, and please excuse my language here. Nick Fuentes is famous for his colourful language. "We want a Christian government. We are having something like a Catholic Taliban rule in America. Catholic autocracy and inquisitions, pretty good stuff. And fuck democracy, we don't want it to be a democracy." Unfortunately for Nick Fuentes, these views put the American First Movement fundamentally at odds with the Founding Fathers, many of whom were exactly the kind of post-Enlightenment Protestant deists whom Fuentes despises. This fact alone puts this movement in a very awkward position because of the fact that the American Constitution has an almost sacral character in American politics. In fact, this division can be seen in many of the online videos in which Charlie Kirk takes on groypers heckling at his talks. Kirk is on a much more solid ground than his groyper opponents. And here I would want to move on and to mention the second comment that Nick Fuentes is the future and boomers, such as myself, are on the way out. I think this is a much more interesting remark than the one about Catholics in public life, but it also relates to a deeper dichotomy than a supposed generational conflict. The implication is that the old post-war consensus is finally collapsing and the new world as yet remains uncertain. I think that this does have a lot of truth in it, and it is why I think the recent excitement about the Jews and Zionism is actually a symptom of the shifting deeper coastal shelves. In these series of talks, I am primarily interested in the long view and the very long view. The growing pains of modernity out of the Ancien regime are still not complete. But in a sense, I believe that Hegel was right, in that it is impossible to go back. Some might say that the rhetoric of Nick Fuentes represents the high point of the antithesis to modernity. But I very much doubt that it will signal the return of Catholic monarchy or even dictatorship. For one thing, the roots of modernity run far too deep. One only needs to look at the ultimate failure of the Catholic restoration of Charles X after the Napoleonic Wars. His reign signalled the end of the old legitimist Bourbon hopes of absolute Catholic monarchy in France. Those dreams never completely died, of course, and the political Catholicism of Nick Fuentes bears some relation to the monarchist ideas of Charles Marat and l'Action Française, for instance. But again, such movements were never able to seize power and return France to the pre-revolutionary period, even when they had the backing of the Catholic Church, which they certainly do not today. This is partly because even the negative and complicated past ultimately must take its place in a national mythology. We can see this in the way that today's National Rally and populists in France wave the hated or previously hated tricolour and celebrate the 14th of July. A similar transformation is in fact happening in Russia today, which sometimes puzzles outsiders and even insiders. The mixing of Soviet and Orthodox symbols, for instance. And I talk about this in my book on the recent history of the Russian Church. So it was that over time a new conservatism arose in the end, which was able to incorporate some of the Enlightenment freedoms with the traditions of the past. These new nationalist conservatives were opposed by the reactionaries, e.g. Bismarck's Kulturkampf, as by the socialists. In time, and especially in the Anglophone post-war world, these became the so-called Western values of the free world of Reagan and Thatcher. And it is noticeable that this phrase is conspicuously absent from Fuentes' talks, although I have to admit I have not watched all of them. The phrase has come to denote, in fact, the opposite of what Nick Fuentes stands for, positing, as it does, religious liberty, individual freedom and so on, against Fuentes' Catholic Taliban. So, on the one hand, I agree with the implication that my generation of decrepit old boomers is passing away, but I disagree maybe that it will be replaced by America First types. Much as I agree and admire Carl Schmitt's anti-Hegelian view of history, in that we can never learn from history and history is chaotic and unpredictable, I do agree with Hegel that some broad currents are discernible in history. Whether or not these are the gradually awakening consciousness of world spirit or freedom in the Hegelian sense, it is difficult to say. In fact, perhaps one could invert Hegel and say, instead, and maybe detect something more pessimistic, the ever-present but ever-increasing spirit of human hubris.